There we go. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the May 2024 meeting of the Environmental Justice Committee of ANC3C. Our guest this evening is Lance Kramer, and I was just going to read his bio from the Meridian Hill Pictures website. Lance is a DC-based filmmaker and co-founder of Meridian Hill Pictures. Lance produced The First Step and the Webby Award-winning documentary series, The Messy Truth. He was selected to the 2018 Sundance Creative Producers Summit, the 2017 Impact Partners Documentary Producers Fellowship, and was named to the DOC NYC 40 Under 40 list in 2021. Lance has been awarded 4 individual arts fellowships by the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities between 2014 and 2022. And in 2014, he received the DC Mayor's Arts Award, the highest honor given to working artists in the city. Lance is going to tell us this evening, he's going to introduce his film, City of Trees, which tells the story. Well, Lance will explain it, he'll show the trailer, but of a federally funded program. The story takes place in 2009, right, Lance? And
well, I can. I can fill in the blanks too.
Okay, he'll fill in the blanks on the film. But we're going to talk about the film, and the film's a few years old now, so we'll talk about its impact, how it was received, and the lessons that we can glean from it about environmental justice work in DC, and some of the challenges that come with that. So our thought is that Lance will show the trailer, give his presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So Lance, thanks for joining us, and please fill in those blanks.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much for the intro. I really appreciate the chance to be here. And thank you also to Laura for making the original invitation. So appreciate you thinking of including the film here. It's a little wild for me to be, and humbling to also just be here sharing the film, because as you mentioned, it's more than a few years old. It's we started making this film, my brother Brandon and I started making this film 14 and a half years ago. So we began working on this back in 2010. It's gratifying to know that it still has resonance, all these years later. In some ways, I almost wish it didn't, and that all the problems in the world were solved. But nonetheless, yeah, just appreciate the fact that it hopefully still has some lessons to share. I thought that it might be helpful to just play the trailer first, which gives a little bit of a taste for what the film is about. And then for anyone, I'm assuming, I guess there's no show of hands, but it's probably safe to assume no one has seen the film. Is there, I don't know, maybe can I just, is that a safe assumption?
I've seen it. I've seen it.
Laura, I know Laura's seen it, but I know you've seen it, but anyways, well, I'll start there. And then what I was thinking was that we could play the trailer. I could talk a little bit about some backstory and just help fill in some of the blanks. But then especially because we have a small group, I'd love for this to be conversational. I don't have a long presentation prepared, and I'd be most interested in hearing your questions or reflections. And I'm happy to just be as open book and transparent as I can be in sharing anything from my experience that could be useful for the work of the committee. So All right, I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully it works. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great, great. So this is the website for the film. It's cityoftriesfilm.com. For anyone who's interested in watching the whole film, I'm going to go ahead and play the trailer.
We're looking for people for whom this program has the biggest likelihood of making a major impact in their life. And we made a specific commitment that we're going to work with people who've had a hard time getting a job.
I can't imagine like where I would be now if I was still doing all the things I was doing a year ago. Like, I would never hustle a day again in my life, ever. I never knew how much I had to live for, what I was putting on the line.
Growing up, I learned all the wrong things. I'm not just getting released from prison. I'm trying to start my life back over.
What would you bring to this job?
I bring some leadership, new ideas. I'm from Southeast, born and raised.
There is no reason why this neighborhood deserves any less standards than any other place in the city, and that's why we're here.
You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. People say, don't ignore Ward 8. But then when you pay attention to Ward 8, they say, what are you doing here in Ward 8?
If you haven't reached the people, what you do is try harder.
If your organization is not physically located in the community, you will be met with a lot of resistance if you don't include the stakeholders. We don't have to come to you, you have to come to us.
Somebody cut the tires or stabbed them.
He went up there, came back, pulled something out of his pocket like he had a gun.
Why are the police not here right now? That's what I want to know.
Call the effing police!
It turns out Parks and People is in worse financial shape than we ever expected to be at this point.
Promises, but nothing guaranteed. I got to answer to my family how we gonna feed or how I'm gonna get my half of the rent. I talk to God every day, but it ain't working no more. It's our community, it's our kids that's walking through that park. Life has two roads. You can take the hard, constructive road, or you can take the easy, destructive road.
All right. We back?
Yep.
Great.
Okay.
So I'll just give a little bit of background on the film, and and then I want to open it up for questions. As I mentioned, as my brother and I started working on the film in 2010. As you get a sense from in the recession, you probably remember from your own experiences, or from the film, and you can remember from your own experiences, it was the thick of the recession. Extremely high unemployment, high needs, you name it at that time. My brother and I were, in a sense, not immune from that. We were ourselves unemployed back in late 2009 or early 2010. We had both ourselves been working for nonprofit organizations that were funded by jobs that were funded by grants that ran out and were not renewed. So we were unemployed in a sense, due to similar circumstances. And in some ways, that's what led us to start our own production company at that time, was almost the absence of not having other job prospects. But we were, I think, particularly drawn to a few things. Number one was just the absence of storytelling at that time that felt like it was dealing with the real challenges that people were facing. It felt like there was either a complete absence of longer form, more in-depth storytelling about these really huge issues. And then in particular, if there was any storytelling that was out there, it felt like there was a lot of focus on the kind of positive side of like the success stories or what's possible. But there was absence of discussion around the challenges, like how it might be hard to accomplish whatever that vision might be for changing the world. The kind of the challenges under the hope and change was what we were really interested in trying to explore further, and felt like there was a real absence of, particularly in the world of like nonprofit storytelling and kind of social change making storytelling. And so anyways, these were things that were in our minds, and also, you know, we were thinking about it from a perspective of being two white men from relatively privileged backgrounds. Even if we were struggling in that moment, we still had a lot of backstops, privilege that we were able to lean on to navigate through that moment, as hard as it might have been for us. And we were particularly interested in what it was like for people that had way less privilege or resources or support than us, who were navigating the moment. So anyways, those kind of contexts, in a sense, like led us to ultimately tell this story, which came about because when we started our production company, Meridian Hill Pictures, we moved into the Josephine Butler Park Center, which is on 15th and Euclid, right across from Meridian Hill Malcolm X Park. And we moved into a vacant space in the attic of the building. And right around the same time that we moved into the building, Washington Parks and People had just received the grant to start the DC Green Corps, which is ultimately what the film focuses on. So in a sense, like right when we moved into the building, this program was just getting started. And we were really interested in trying to tell a story about how people were navigating the recovery, the recession and the recovery. And lo and behold, we met Steve Coleman, the protagonist, one of the protagonists of the film, so the director of Washington Parks and People, and learned about this program, which was one of the largest green job training programs that was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that was literally not even happening in our backyard, but literally in our building was being run. So we wound up ultimately at first just going out to document for a day the work that was being done on the very first site that the DC Green Corps was working on, which was, now it's called the North Columbia Heights Green. It's right off, it's right just east of 14th Street in Columbia Heights. It's a vacant alley that was turned into a community garden. And we went out for an afternoon to film the DC Green Corps working on turning the blighted space into a community garden. We were immediately blown away by not just the work that was being done to the space, but also just talking to the people who were working and learning more about their stories and what they were going through and what they were hoping to do with their lives, and also what their experiences were like having this, in most cases, first kind of foray into the green economy through doing this work, and what it meant to them. And so we were just immediately drawn in to understanding this world better. And that led us on this, ultimately what became a 5-year journey. We spent 3 years filming with the DC Green Corps and 2 years editing the film. In particular, what we wound up doing was documenting the whole life cycle of the grant. So the DC Green Corps had received through ARA, if everyone remembers what ARA was, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was like the $787 billion stimulus. A lot of that, I think about a third of it was grants that went to different community organizations and partners. So Washington Parks and People received a roughly $2.5 million grant to employ about 150 people over the course of 2 years through 4 cohorts of trainings. And we wanted to actually document the full life cycle of the grant from we weren't there from the very beginning, but nearly the very beginning through the conclusion, and then after the grant ended. The film ultimately focuses mostly on the last 6 months or so before the grant ran out. And even though we had been filming for about 2 years with leadership at Washington Parks and People, trainees, and community leaders, particularly east of the river, we found that in the last 6 months or so before the grant ran out, that's where a lot of these themes really came to light most starkly. A lot of the tensions that had been, in a sense, brewing throughout those 2 years became almost more visible and more stark relief in that last period of time before the money ran out, where obviously the economic needs were still very present, but there was now no longer a promise of the money being continued with the grant. So that created all kinds of pressures. The organization was also dealing or navigating racial dynamics in the organization and in the community where I was working, community engagement challenges, sustainability challenges around stewardship of the parks and the trees and the spaces that were being worked on, and what happens after the grant runs out. All these kinds of things were just extremely challenging and stressful for everyone who was involved. And we really appreciated how honest and open everyone was with us in inviting us into these really difficult moments in people's lives to what I would consider to be extend this really generous act of sharing their stories at such a vulnerable moment. And so we felt this really strong responsibility to tell the story with a lot of nuance and complexity, but hopefully a lot of care, to respect that kind of courage that people had to share these really vulnerable moments. And I think that the outcome of that was that the film was able to do things that maybe would have been much more difficult had we maybe just focused on being, say, like more promotional. Like, we're going to show you all the good things that might happen when you plant trees in a neighborhood, and not talk about the challenges, or what happens when you give someone a job, but you don't talk about what happens when that job ends, because it was a short-term job training program. So because I think we dealt with those challenges and those complexities in a way that a lot of people I don't think had seen quite that way, the film was able to move through all kinds of spaces. We did, over the course of about 2 years of sharing the film through its kind of extended release, it played in about 35 different film festivals across the country. Some of those were environmental, but not all. So it kind of had a little bit of a boost originally from in environmental spaces, but really, in a sense, the film, even though it's dealing with environmental themes, it also is dealing with, I think, a lot of broader themes around social, change making and just very human issues that aren't just restricted to environmental circles. It was ultimately picked up and screened for a few years on Netflix. It was on PBS. And then one of the most interesting developments from the whole experience was that the program, and I'll maybe end on this note before I open up for questions, was that the stimulus grant that Washington Parks and People received was administered through the USDA Forest Service. So, the money kind of went from Congress through the different agencies and then to nonprofits and then ultimately into people's pockets. So the Forest Service, through the Urban Forestry Administration, was the entity that administered the grant that Washington Parks and People received. So then we, as the filmmakers, wound up receiving a grant several years later to actually work with the US Forest Service to develop training materials to accompany the film to help urban forestry practitioners, nonprofit organizations in the environment and otherwise to be able to use the film as a training tool and a discussion and a catalyst for having conversations around racial justice, economic justice, community engagement, opening up honest and hard conversations about these kinds of issues and challenges that a lot of people who are on the ground level face every day, but have a really hard time holding space for having conversations, either internally amongst their organizations or externally with stakeholders that they work with. And they thankfully identified that the film had a kind of unique ability to create those kinds of bridges or open up those kinds of dialogues. And so we spent about a year working with several people at the US Forest Service to design this discussion guide. That we did a number of pilot screenings and surveys and studies to come up with a structure, and then ultimately co-publish this guide that I can share with all of you as well. It's a free resource. And we wound up doing a number of discussions and trainings, both locally here in DC and then around the country, using the film and the guide. I guess what it showed me was that this is a very, very hard film to make. It was a very hard film to also release and distribute. But it showed me that there was a real strong desire for films that dealt with these kinds of themes like environmental justice with a kind of openness and embrace of complexity and nuance and messiness even, and that created a really important springboard for people to be able to have conversations. And in some ways it even just felt like a relief to be able to kind of let your shoulders down and connect and talk about how hard but also how important this work is. And so that's just been something that, especially since making the film now almost 10 years ago, I've been very committed to carrying that same kind of approach and ethic forward in everything that I've been doing, since that time. I'll pause there. So I could could go in any direction that's useful or interesting to you all, but I'll stop myself there.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I think the point I'd like to start with is the sense of community building. It was in the trailer. Somebody said that if your organization isn't based in the neighborhood where the work's being done, that's your first challenge right there. And you talked about how your office was in Columbia Heights or 16th Street near the park, and and you came across the stories too, just based on where you were. So I find it really challenging to build these connections with people working in environmental justice space across DC and probably in other fields too. So I'm just wondering, what were some of your takeaways about how does one go about that work in the city in a way that is effective? And yeah, do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure, I do. I think it's a really good question. And I should maybe just caveat, or I think it's a caveat, or just at least, footnote all this, that I'm not an environmental expert. I don't have a background in anything environmental. I'm really bad at planting trees. I'm terrible at taking care of gardens. I couldn't identify trees or flower species, or I love Mother Nature, but I'm really, I'm the furthest thing from an expert. So I come at all this work as like a storyteller, and someone who's very curious and who cares. But I don't have the level of expertise, or and also even the social engagement and social work or nonprofit expertise either. So everything to me is coming, or my entry point is as a storyteller,
So how do you do it
filmmaker,
as a storyteller?
and so I think that like my answer to that kind of is also like shaped from obviously my perspective, that I think one of the most important things from my point of view is relationship building. And it maybe just maybe sounds simple, but I think it's one of the hardest things in the world to do, to build authentic and meaningful and trusting relationships. And I think in a lot of different spaces that gets shortcut or passed over. And I think particularly when you're dealing with entrenched injustices, there's usually a lot of distrust and harm that precedes whatever situation you might be entering into, before any words are spoken, or in this case, before a shovel breaks ground or whatever the case is. It's often a lot of harm or distrust that's, in the room before day one. And so I think that the effort that goes into relationship building like cannot be understated. And all that work, I think to me is the most like critical piece. And that's, I think a lot of times the thing, I've observed, and, Washington Parks and People in particular was in a really hard place, because I think maybe if they had their druthers, they would have rather not had 2 years, but been able to stretch this big grant out over time. It was a lot of money that they received relative to their normal operating budget. And they were used to spending more time building relationships and having a little and trying to stretch it out and do as much as they can. They had this situation where they had a mandate to do a lot of stuff in a very short period of time, because that was the nature of the stimulus. So they had to work quickly by law almost. And so that, in a sense, is almost at odds with the way that relationship building kind of wants to work. And I think also with environmental work too, you want to be able to see the results sometimes, like see the work happening visibly. Like that's how we might be maybe hardwired to understand progress. But I think that that like person to person work kind of needs to undergird everything. And I think that that's hard enough even in our own neighborhood to like get to know our neighbors. And I think a lot of us probably don't know. I'm lucky I know Laura, but I don't know everyone in my own neighborhood. So that can be hard enough even on our own street or our own neighborhood. And then when you add the complexity of working in a community that's not your own, even if it's in the same city, I think it's just gets exponentially more complex. So I think that, anyways, it's a long way of saying that the work that goes into the relationships is key, and checking maybe the other piece of it too is just checking your assumptions, or just the things that come, particularly if you're trying to do work in a community that you don't call your own. It can be really easy sometimes to get in the mindset of like having a judgment, or thinking you have an answer that someone else hasn't thought of themselves, and that you have a better idea, or a better way of doing things. But I think that it's really important to listen. If that kind of thought pattern or that thought cycle emerges, then it's really important to listen to that and check it, because my experience is a lot of times, people who, I feel this way about my own street, and I know most people feel this way too, is usually the ideas that people have about their own neighborhood or their own community are completely valid and right, and are really important to take really seriously, and a lot of times haven't been taken seriously, or other things have been imposed on them.
If I can.
Sure.
And thank you for this. This is awesome. Great work. And like with the going into communities thing, I think there a lot of times people might feel like things are being done to them and not for them, when you really need to communicate the message as to like why we're going to rip up this street to fix the stormwater system. And it's because we don't want raw sewage flowing down the street. So sorry, it's like gonna be a minute, but we're doing it for the good of the community, and it's not being done to you, it's being done like for you to help everyone. And this the program that I'm not as familiar with that one, but that you covered, but I'm familiar more so, but not entirely completely, with Solar for All, which is a more recent program where that's also a jobs building program now, because we figured out that the district did that when you're going in and asking to put solar panels on people's homes to help with their, energy bills and stuff, when you have like the white guy engineer rolling into like Ward 7 and 8, they're not going to be trusted. Like, it's just so building up the community of the folks that live there, that are talking to their neighbors that know them about the project and the program, and getting folks signed up by doing that and fostering that. Like, we all know each other, we're neighbors, and it works a lot better that way. The same goes with like lead pipe replacement stuff. Like, people don't trust the government, and for a lot of fair reasons, a lot of the time. So I think that a lot of the things that you brought up and what you were talking about, and what I kind of saw in the trailer, like, there's a lot of lessons learned in that, and just a lot more opportunity to gain the community's trust and to get people good jobs, good green jobs too. So this is fascinating, and I'm glad that it became the teaching tool that it has. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to say to your point. I mean, I agree with you, and I think I mean, it's the nature of government. It can be the nature of nonprofit organizations, of anything, business too, but particularly I think happens with government and nonprofits, where you have these constraints, whether it's grant report requirements or whatever the kind of outcomes are that are being measured, that someone who's in the position of delivering a service, or kind of being the frontline change maker provider, is kind of expected to do and deliver upon, and then just it's inherently incongruous with kind of what people self-identify as needing, or how they want things to be. And so I think it's a really, really hard position to be in when you're having to negotiate that set of like competing demands. But I think all too often it can be really easy to kind of mute the community's needs, and just kind of go by whatever the program or the funder or what have you requires. I think in the case of Washington Parks and People and the story in the film, even when you're trying really hard, it can still be really hard. And so like trying doesn't absolve you of challenge. And so, I mean, I think Brian says it in the trailer where he says, like, try harder. It's almost like if you're having a hard time, it's like sometimes you have to even just try harder, and it might not be a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's just you have to try even harder. And I think that sometimes we can also mistake the challenges as a reason to like step back. You run into a roadblock or a challenge, and then people can get scared and then retreat. And actually, I think that's exactly the moment when you actually have to try harder, like lean in, because it's almost always going to happen. there's always going to be some sort of challenge you're going to run into. So it's also, I think, really important to notice when those moments are happening and then understand what does it look like to actually kind of lean in and try harder rather than just shut down or retreat or clamp up or run into your corner.
It's almost always, if not 99%, fear-based is where you're going to run into that resistance. There's always a fear of something behind it, and it's getting to the root of like, what is that fear? Like, what am I not explaining properly? What can we do better to meet you where you are? And like, and maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with what is trying to be accomplished here, but like, let's get to that point in this conversation to like get that out there so that we can resolve that fear. And it's usually as simple as a just misunderstanding. Like, I hate when the engineers come to our meetings and go through engineering drawings with people, and like, people don't care about the diameter of the sewer pipe. They just don't. Can we like talk about the impacts to them above ground and why we're doing the project? We try sometimes more successfully than others with these.
And it's like, and I think things, just really powerful things emerge through like listening too. It could be easy to say, well, why wouldn't you want trees in a neighborhood that doesn't have as dense of tree canopy? Aren't trees just good? Why wouldn't you want more trees? But then you start to listen to it and say, well, who's going to take care of the trees? If you're going to put trees in the park or in our street or our yard, but you're not going to set us up to take care of them, what's going to happen when they need care? Or wait, if the trees are desirable, then that's going to make it more desirable to live here, which is going to make it more expensive. But then does that mean that the trees are for me, or are the trees going to be for somebody else? And I can't actually enjoy those trees or the beautification of the neighborhood because they're actually maybe for someone else who's going to, so it's like these kinds of thorny questions and anxieties and concerns, I think, materialize. And I think that, that's just specifically talking about this instance, but I think that it's important to be able to dialogue with each other. And usually I think there is a path forward, but a lot of times I think people don't feel like they're given a chance to be heard.
Mm.
Anybody else has a question? Feel free to jump in. Madeline?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lance. It's just very, very interesting conversation. I wish I'd seen the movie because I found the trailer very, the trailers are always too short anyway, and then you have snippets of this and that, and it's hard to figure out. But so I don't know. You did mention in your comments that you decided to finding the movies about the last year or something, like the last parts of the program. Could you discuss a little bit more why and how? Like, I assume like having a movie made over 2 years is a lot of footage, and you need to make some kind of a story, I suppose. But also, but in terms of what what came about after 2 years, and whether the good and the bad, and also what happens to those poor trees. That's what you wanted.
Sure.
So, I'm sorry to be. I really hope the trees are still there. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And I'm sorry if I glossed over anything in the beginning. The structure of the grant, I hope I'm getting this right because it's been a little while, but there was about 2 years that the organization had. They ran 4 cohorts each had about 30 to 40 people. I think in the beginning there was a little smaller, ramped up towards the end by the fourth cohort, where they were 3 to 4 months of paid training, where everyone who was recruited, mostly, I think it was largely people east of the river, wasn't exclusively, but there were a lot of people east of the river, a lot of people, mostly people who were long-term unemployed. There were several people who were returning citizens, recently returned from prison. And they were paid to go through the training. They got a basic introduction to urban forestry, tree planting, park stewardship, all these kinds of things, doing work on different sites. They started working in Ward 1 at the North Columbia Heights Green, but by the end, on the fourth cohort, they were working largely in Ward 8 in Oxen Run Park in Southeast. So also each cohort kind of shifted what site they were working on. I think in the second and third cohort, they were also doing a lot of work in Ward 7, right off Nanny Helen Burroughs, in the Marvin Gaye Park. So anyways, each cohort was very different, even though there was this kind of common structure of like 3 to 4 month paid training, and a core curriculum and all these kinds of, and certain like modules that they were learning. The reason why we felt it was important to focus, and we filmed through all of this. So from over the course of the 2 years, we had, I think, over 300 hours of material that we had filmed, and a lot of people that we met. I mean, dozens of people that we had met in the course of the project. What occurred to us was that, like I was mentioning, and it was in that last fourth cohort where it felt like the story was at its strongest, because that's where, in a sense, the leadership of the program and the trainees and the community members were most linked together, because there was a certain type of paradigm maybe earlier on where it's like, we have the money, we have a program, we have something to offer, and a little bit more kind of comfort in a sense as the organization, even though it was very hard for them. There was more space maybe between where the organization was at and where the trainees were at. Whereas as the clock ticked down and then the organization found itself about to lose this big grant without a promise for renewing, now all of a sudden the trainees were always going to have that 3 to 4 months and then be done and then have to find their next employment. Now the organization was in that boat too, where they had to figure out as an organization and as leadership, what do we do next? And they had hired new staff. They had ramped up and kind of built up this new paradigm to support managing and running this really ambitious, big program. And now they were also facing, how do we face that kind of cliff, just like, in a sense, the trainees. And in a sense, the community, you see Brenda Richardson in the film, in the trailer, mentioning, speaking to some of those concerns, but then the community was expressing similar kinds of concerns about what happens to the spaces and the trees and, the work that had been done on the community level when this money runs out. And so to us, we just felt like the intersection between all those different forces, it was hard to experience and to be in the presence of, but it felt really kind of profound to be able to see what that intersection felt like. And so that's, I think, why we just decided to kind of lean into that period of time. It was a little heartbreaking to realize that we had filmed things for 18 months and hundreds of hours that actually just left on the cutting room floor. But hopefully when people watch the film, they don't have to wade through all this extra time and can get right to the story. And I should say that Washington Parks and People is still around and going strong. They've been around for, I think, 30 plus years. They're still, I actually don't even know now what cohort they're in, but even after the big stimulus grant ended, they shifted their business model. And it took a few years to kind of reconfigure, but my understanding is that they derive a lot of their income now from usage of the building in particular. And a lot of earned income through like weddings and event usage of the building, which is then fueling the continuation of programs like the Green Corps. And they've done dozens of cohorts since the kind of initial stimulus grant ended, and I know that they're still working in all those green spaces. I know a lot of the trees are still growing and thriving. I'm sure there's some that didn't make it, but I couldn't give you specifics. But a lot of those spaces are really, it's pretty profound to see how they've also changed in the last 10, 15 years.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that the program continued.
It continued.
Yeah,
it had this real sharp cliff when it went from being this big thing to right afterwards. There was definitely a sharp cliff that they experienced, and then they continued onwards and kind of reconstituted in a new model, and they're still active today.
Oh, it's good. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Sure.
Hey, Laura, go ahead.
Lance, thanks for sharing all this with the committee.
Sure.
We appreciate the details and context for us. It's very helpful. I've had conversations with you in the past about the kind of transition that you experienced where initially there was some resistance to the content of the film, and then with the Park Service, and then that transition to what you described as it being used as a tool for helping to learn from successes and failures alike in the past. I would find it really helpful for you to describe in a little bit more detail how that transition occurred, and if there were any particularly important points in that timeline that are helpful to understand the willingness and acceptance to examine successes and failures in a program like this, if that makes sense.
Sure. This is testing my memory too, because this is all a while back. But yeah, there was originally, and specifically speaking to the Forest Service, there was certainly trepidation to document, even just to film the program. There was trepidation. This was a highly politicized initiative. I think ARA passed on a completely partisan vote. I'm not sure there was this. I think it was all Democrats that voted in support and not a single Republican. I think, don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure it was a straight partisan vote. It's one of the first votes in the U.S. Congress after Obama took office. The Washington Parks and People grant in particular was rescinded on the floor of the Capitol. So it was actually redlined and X'd out of the grantees. It was singled out because there was a Western senator or senator from Western state who received a lot of forest fire funding from the USDA Forest Service, and basically like singled out Washington Parks and People as saying, like, what are we sending $2.5 million to a nonprofit organization in the city that says that it plants trees and runs urban park festivals and like, you know, US Forest Service money needs to be going to forests, not to cities. Like there was a whole episode and got covered in the Washington Times and all this stuff. So then there was an emergency effort to actually restore the funding to make sure that they could actually get the grant. And this is even before the program started. So there was just a lot of really hotly contested politics just around the even nature of doing a forestry program in the city to begin with. So the US Forest Service, I think, was under a lot of scrutiny to pull these kinds of things off. And they were just being careful and they were sensitive and they were worried about further blowback. And so I think that they felt like keeping it under the radar maybe was just the way to just ensure that it could avoid more of this this kind of controversy. I think that was the starting point. I think what changed was, for one, we just spent so much time with the program. I mean, like I said, we spent years together. So we weren't just swooping in, trying to film for a day or two and then have some sort of, you know, like gotcha moment and then, or snazzy moment and then move on. Like we just had this sustained interest in the story. So we were just there a lot. So I think just seeing that we were a constant presence helped them understand that we weren't just the news looking to get a quick story. We weren't just trying to score some points. There was a real sustained, genuine interest. And then we also at a certain point interviewed or asked to interview the US Forest Service grant officers because we actually just wanted to hear from them and understand their side of the story and their point of view. And I think maybe up until that point, we were like these mysterious filmmakers that they had never met or heard or talked to directly. But then we actually just wanted to interview them directly. And I think that helped to break down and demystify whatever sort of perceptions they had about us. And we really connected. And I think they just understood, you know, what our intentions were with the film. And then ultimately we built a relationship with them. We got to know them really well before, I mean, which is what preceded them making this grant. And then in particular, we also built a really close relationship with the then urban forester for the city. Her name is Monica Lear. And she ultimately actually went from working for UFA DDOT as the urban forester to actually working for the US Forest Service. But we got to know her really well too. I think she was at the time one of the only Black urban forest state or city or urban foresters. And she really believed in what we were doing with the story and wound up being a big champion and ally for the film. And I think that having her kind of blessing and buy-in made a big difference. But even after all that, the US Forest Service that grant came about, I don't know, a year or so after the film had been finished. So it wasn't a right away kind of thing. And for outreach, they made two grants. They made a grant to help finish the film, and then they made a secondary grant to help with this outreach and discussion guide. And I think it was like a process of just almost testing the waters and seeing like what was possible. And I think what they saw was that we were able to share the film in environmental spaces. And then we were also sharing the film in spaces that were frankly like very white. And then it was also being really well received in spaces that were not environmental, and also spaces that were either largely or entirely people of color, and that the film was able to move between different audiences and different kinds of spaces fairly fluidly. And I think that that was something that they self-identified as being a real struggle of the agency. And so I think when they were seeing the film's ability to move through different audiences and different spaces, I think that was a real light bulb.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
But yeah.
It's interesting to hear the parallels between your story as a storyteller and a filmmaker.
Right.
Trust, and then producing a product that is used now to build trust and deepen relationships among people. Okay, we only have a few minutes.
Laura, does that help to, did that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lance.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. If anybody else would like to chime in.
I can also just make sure that, I mean, I don't know, Laura, I can send it to you, or Rorik. I can send you a link to the film. I was going to say, I can send a link to the film, just a password protected link that anyone, you know, in the committee can watch without having to rent it. So you can save yourself a few bucks.
Rorik, just quickly, I have to drop for WPCA, but this was really a great presentation, and I'm very happy that you set it up.
Thank you, Commissioner Prinzo. We do have one more hand raised. If Adam Elkins would like to speak.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking here. This is actually my first time on one of these calls too, but it was just really interesting hearing about this program and the journey you took throughout it as the story got, you know, more and more complex and interesting. I took down my hand because I was actually going to ask how to view the film, and it sounds like you've answered that. So.
Oh, well, I didn't mean to steal your thunder. But yeah, I can. I'm happy to send a link that you all are welcome to, you know, if you want to watch without having to rent the film, you know, no problem. It should be on Apple, like iTunes for rental. It's on Amazon for rental. They have it in the library in DVD form, and then also it's on Canopy, which is the library's like own streaming service. So you could stream it for free using your library card. And then it's on, I think, a bunch of other like less recognizable, you know, things with 4-letter words, that Tubi and some others. But then also what I can do is send the link to the discussion guide, which is also, that's free and you can download it as a PDF. We structured it in a very particular way so that it's kind of adaptable based on different kinds of contexts that you might use the film. So obviously, if you just watch it yourself, you know, no need for discussion guide because it's just solo. But you know, our hope was always that one of the ways the film could be experienced is to be able to you know, bring the film to, you know, a community that you hoped to spur a conversation, you know, with. So whether that's like a brown bag lunch kind of thing at work, whether it's, you know, you're working with the community and it's early in the process of relationship building and it's a kind of shared experience that you can have together to be able to have a common point of reference, to be able to talk about things together, whether it's like a new group that's forming for the first time and trying to find a common language together or common framework. You know, any kinds of situations, but that's a hope of ours, is that it could be used in that kind of way. So certainly if you wind up watching the film yourself and then feel like it could have value in those contexts, like we'd be really gratified. And at this point we don't really make much money from it. It's a lot of the places people can watch it is for free, so we're just happy to see it really just be used.
Great. Yeah, thanks for offering us access to it. You can send that to me. We can send it along to everybody.
Sure. And then also, there's if there's anyone, everyone who's in the film is local. So if you all happen to watch the film, and then if there's people who you see in the film who you're interested in connecting with, I'm happy to make introductions, whether it's people at Parks and People, at the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service partners are not as visible in the film, but I'm still in touch with a number of them. So if there's people at the national or federal level that you're interested in connecting with, or anyone, or if you go on the website, you could see some of the other organizations that we screened with or partnered with, not just in the city, but nationally on screenings. So if there's anyone of those organizational partners too, I'm happy to make any kind of connection that I can, that would be helpful.
Thanks. Okay, well, we're out of time. So thank you very much, Lance, for speaking with us tonight. See you around the neighborhood. And
I don't think I realize that.
okay, let's leave it there.
Okay. All right, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, we'll see you around the neighborhood. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks. Good night.